I arrived in Devon in early May, when the hedgerows were thick and bright, and the air smelled like damp soil and cut grass. I had rented the cottage for 3 weeks. I wanted quiet, distance, and something steady after the breakup. The listing showed a stone house sitting alone between long fields and low hills. No nearby roads, no neighboring houses in sight. Just green land divided by old walls and narrow lanes. The owner had met me briefly when I arrived. He walked me through the basics, pointed out the boiler, the fuse box, and the narrow path that cut through the field behind the cottage. At the edge of the property, he said, there was an old beekeeping shed. It had not been used in years. I did not need to worry about it. I noticed the way he mentioned it quickly, like something unimportant that still had to be said. The cottage itself was perfect for writing. Thick walls, small windows, wooden floors that creaked softly. In the mornings, mist sat low over the fields. By afternoon, the hills looked endless and bright under slow-moving clouds. I wrote for hours each day at the kitchen table. When my eyes burned or my thoughts stalled, I walked the field behind the house. The land rose gently for about 200 meters before meeting a slope. Halfway up that slope sat the shed. It was small, built from rough timber, and sunk into the hill, so the back wall disappeared into earth. The roof leaned slightly. The door hung crooked, one hinge rusted but still holding. From a distance it looked abandoned in the way old farm structures often do, weathered but settled into the landscape. On the third day, I walked up to it. The grass around it was shorter than the rest of the field. Not freshly cut, but pressed down as if something moved through it often. The door stood closed but not latched. When I pushed it open, it gave easily. Inside, the air smelled dry and faintly sweet. The space was packed with hive boxes stacked in columns along the walls. Wooden frames, lids, spare parts. Everything was arranged neatly. Too neatly for a place that had not been touched in years. The wood was dusty but not thick with cobwebs. The floor had only a thin layer of dirt. I expected signs of decay. Rot, insects, nests. Instead it looked like someone had cleaned it and then simply stopped coming. On a crate near the back wall, I found a notebook. The pages were filled with tight handwriting. Dates, weather conditions, notes about temperature and flowering times. Some entries mentioned hive strength, queen behavior, honey yield. The writing ran consistently until late summer 2003. Then it stopped. On the last page, below the final entry, there was one more line written in darker ink and a different hand. They are quiet today. There was no date. I closed the notebook and left it where I found it. After that, the shed stayed in my mind. Not because of anything dramatic, but because of small details that did not fit. The pressed grass, the lack of cobwebs, the feeling inside the space that it was maintained without anyone admitting to it. I kept walking the field each afternoon. The view helped clear my head. But after that visit, I noticed something else. Every time I crossed the midpoint of the field, where the land opened and the cottage sat behind me, I felt watched. There was no one there. No houses, no road, no movement in the hedges. Still, the feeling stayed, a tightness between my shoulder blades that made me glance back more often than I wanted to admit. I told myself it was isolation, my brain adjusting to silence. The nights were very quiet. No traffic, no distant voices. Only wind through grass and the occasional call of a bird settling in the dark. By the end of the first week, I slept deeply. Then one night, I woke at 11:40 p.m. At first I did not know what had pulled me up from sleep. Then I heard it. A low hum. It was steady and mechanical, like electrical wires vibrating or a distant transformer. The sound came from outside the bedroom window, which faced the field. It was not loud, but it carried through the silence in a way that felt close. I went to the window and pushed the curtain aside. The field lay flat and still under moonlight. No wind. The grass did not move. The hum continued for several seconds, then faded slowly, like something powering down. That was when I noticed the shed. The door stood wide open. I was certain I had left it closed days earlier. I watched for movement, but saw none. After a minute, the sound was gone completely. I locked the window and went back to bed, though I did not sleep much after that. In the morning, I walked out to the shed. The grass was damp with dew. The ground held impressions easily, but I saw no footprints other than my own. When I reached the structure, I stopped. Every hive box inside had been knocked over. Stacks that had stood in clean columns now lay scattered across the floor. Lids off, frames tilted, with pieces spread out like someone had gone through them quickly and without care. Nothing was broken. Nothing was taken. The notebook still sat on the crate. I checked the ground outside again. The soil near the entrance was soft, but there were no clear shoe prints, no tire marks, nothing that suggested someone had walked there during the night. The wind had been calm. The sky had been clear. There was no reason for the boxes to fall. I did not touch anything. I walked back to the cottage and called the owner. He sounded surprised and insisted no one else had keys to the property. He suggested animals, though there were no droppings, no chew marks, and no sign of forced entry. That afternoon, I paid closer attention to the field. Near the lower hedge, I found a narrow gap where the branches had been pushed aside repeatedly. On the other side ran a shallow track, barely visible, cutting between fields toward a distant farm road. The grass along that track was flattened in the same way I had seen near the shed. The pattern became clear once I noticed it. Someone had been using the land as a shortcut. The shed sat directly along that hidden path. It was dry, sheltered, and out of sight from the cottage unless someone looked directly at it. That night, I did not sleep. Around midnight, the hum returned. This time I did not go to the window. Instead, I stepped quietly into the kitchen and turned off all lights. From the dark, I watched the field. After several minutes, a small beam of light moved near the shed. A flashlight, kept low and shielded. The beam disappeared inside. The hum rose again, louder now, steady and mechanical. Later, I learned what it likely was. Portable honey extraction equipment uses a small electric motor that produces that exact sound. Someone had been using the abandoned hive boxes to harvest feral colonies or store equipment between visits. The neat stacking I saw earlier had been their work. The disturbance that night came from them pulling boxes down quickly. The final notebook entry made sense too. Bees go silent when colonies collapse or are removed. They are quiet today. The next morning, I packed my things. Before leaving, I walked once more to the hedge gap. The track was clearer in daylight. Fresh impressions marked the soil. Not boots. Narrow tread, likely a small utility vehicle or bike used off the road. The cottage owner later confirmed that a nearby hobbyist beekeeper had lost access to his land years earlier and had been warned for trespassing more than once. He believed the shed was abandoned and continued using it at night to avoid being seen. The feeling of being watched had not been imagined. Someone had been crossing that field regularly. Close enough to see the cottage lights. Close enough to know when I was inside. I ended the retreat early. The quiet I had wanted was still there, but it no longer felt empty. It felt shared by someone who preferred not to be noticed. July 2015 was the peak of the monsoon, the kind of season when the land never feels dry and the air carries the smell of wet soil everywhere. That night, 4 of us were driving back from a wedding in a small town in rural northern India. The celebration had run late. By the time we left, it was already dark, the sky heavy with low clouds and no sign of the moon. The main highway was known for long traffic jams during wedding season, especially with trucks and buses moving slowly through waterlogged stretches. One of my friends suggested a shortcut along a canal road that ran through farmland and connected back to the highway several kilometers ahead. It sounded practical. We were tired, dressed in wrinkled formal clothes, and eager to reach home. The turn toward the canal was easy to miss. A narrow road branched off from the main route, barely marked, its edges broken and uneven. Once we left the wider road, the world changed quickly. The streetlights disappeared. Houses became rare. Within minutes, we were alone between open fields and darkness. The road was just wide enough for one vehicle. On the left side ran the canal, filled to the brim with monsoon water. It looked black under the headlights, smooth and silent, moving slowly but steadily. On the right side stood thick sugarcane fields. The plants were tall, well above head height, packed tightly in straight rows. From inside the car, the fields looked like a wall, dense and unreadable. The air smelled of wet leaves and stagnant water. Frogs and insects filled the silence with constant noise. Every few minutes the tires hit a pothole filled with muddy water, sending a dull splash against the underside of the car. We drove slowly, careful not to slip off the narrow edge into the canal. There was no other traffic. No houses. No lights in the distance. Only the road, the water, and the fields. Around 10:30 p.m., as we rounded a slight bend, the headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. At first it looked like a reflection or a scarecrow. Then the shape became clear. A man stood facing us, wearing a white shirt and dark lower clothing. He was still, arms at his sides, not signaling, not moving. Our driver slowed immediately. The car rolled forward at a crawl. The headlights brightened the figure as we approached. The shirt looked plain and wet, clinging slightly. His face was difficult to see because of the glare. What stood out was the stillness. No reaction. No attempt to move aside. The canal was on one side, the sugarcane wall on the other. There was no space to turn around. When we were about 15 meters away, the man stepped off the road without looking at us and walked directly into the sugarcane. The plant swallowed him in seconds. We drove past the spot slowly. No sound came from the field. No movement. Just the rustling of leaves in the light wind. For a few seconds, none of us reacted. Then curiosity took over. The situation felt strange. A person standing alone at night in that place, then disappearing without a word. We stopped the car about 20 meters ahead. One of us switched on a flashlight. The beam cut through the dark toward the spot where he had entered. The edge of the field showed flattened mud from rain, but no clear footprints. The flashlight moved along the rows. The cane stood still, wet leaves shining. There was nothing inside. The silence felt heavier now. Even the insect noise seemed distant. Then something changed deeper in the field. About 30 meters in, the cane began to move. It did not sway with the wind. It parted in a straight path. Leaves pushed aside in a line, fast and direct, coming toward the road. The movement was steady and purposeful, like someone walking quickly through the rows. The flashlight followed the line of motion. We could not see a person, only the plants bending and separating. The path was coming straight toward where we stood. The feeling in the car shifted from curiosity to alarm. The flashlight switched off. All of us got back inside and shut the doors. The driver turned the key. The engine did not start. He tried again. The starter clicked, but the engine failed to turn over fully. The dashboard lights flickered. Outside, the cane kept moving closer. The line reached the edge of the field and stopped. The plants at the boundary trembled once, then became still. No one stepped out. No sound came from the edge. No breathing. No footsteps. Nothing. The driver tried again. The engine coughed, but did not catch. The air inside the car felt thick. Windows fogged slightly from our breath and the humidity. The canal water beside us moved quietly. There was nowhere to go if someone approached from the field. The road was too narrow to reverse quickly without risk of sliding toward the water. For a few seconds that felt much longer, nothing happened outside. Then the driver turned the key again. This time the engine started. He pressed the accelerator immediately. The car moved forward, tires slipping slightly on the wet surface before gaining grip. No one looked back. No one spoke. We drove faster than before, ignoring potholes, staying close to the center of the narrow road. The canal continued beside us for several more kilometers. The sugarcane fields never ended. After what felt like half an hour, we saw distant lights and reached the highway. Traffic noise and movement returned. Only then did the tension begin to fade. We did not talk about it much that night. Everyone was tired and unsettled, but the memory stayed sharp. A few days later, we mentioned the incident to people from that area. What we learned explained most of it. During monsoon season, sugarcane fields often attract thieves who cut and steal cane at night. Farmers sometimes organize watch groups. Instead of confronting vehicles directly, they use intimidation to discourage strangers from stopping near the fields. A person standing in the road forces vehicles to slow. If the vehicle stops or looks suspicious, others move through the field quickly to surround or observe. The moving cane we saw was likely more than one person walking in a line through the rows. The engine failure also had a simple cause. The canal road was low and damp. Later inspection showed moisture had affected the battery terminals, reducing contact. The repeated starting attempts cleared the connection enough for the engine to turn over. There was one detail that stayed with me. We went back to that stretch weeks later during daylight out of curiosity. The mud at the field edge was deep and soft from rain. Any person walking barefoot would leave clear impressions. That night, when we had shown the flashlight, the mud had looked smooth. No fresh prints. No disturbance except where the cane had moved deeper inside. Local farmers later confirmed they usually wore boots or sandals during patrol because of leeches and sharp stubble. No one walked barefoot in those conditions. That meant the man we saw on the road was not barefoot, as we first thought. It was only the reflection and distance that hid the footwear. The explanation was practical and complete. Field watchers, hidden movement through the rows, and a damp electrical contact in an old car. Even with the logic in place, I never take canal shortcuts anymore. There is something about a narrow road, black water on one side, tall crops on the other, and no escape in either direction that changes how you think. That night taught me that isolation itself is enough to create fear. Nothing supernatural happened. But for those minutes beside the field, with the engine silent and the plants moving toward us, the countryside did not feel empty at all. My name is Carlos Mendoza, and in April of 2021 I was working as a field technician for a small surveying company based out of Albuquerque. Most of our jobs were routine: boundary checks, elevation mapping, site prep for utilities or construction. That week we were contracted to survey a parcel of private land in rural eastern New Mexico for a future wind turbine installation. The job looked simple on paper. Flat terrain, no structures in use, one old homestead marked as abandoned. I drove out with one coworker, Aaron. We left the city late afternoon and reached the site just before 6. The land stretched out in every direction, dry and pale, with low grass and patches of bare soil. No fences nearby. No active roads, just a long dirt track that cut through the property. The wind never stopped out there. It moved in steady pushes, bending the grass in wide waves. About a quarter mile from our marked coordinates stood the old homestead. One house, low and square, sun-bleached and worn down to gray wood. No doors. Most windows broken or missing. Behind it stood a rusted metal windmill, the old farm type with a narrow tower and circular blades. The blades did not turn. They were locked in place, tilted slightly, creaking now and then when the wind hit them from the side. We parked the truck near the work area and started unloading equipment. Tripod, total station, GPS receiver. The plan was to set reference points before dark and finish measurements the next morning. The air cooled quickly as the sun dropped. Long shadows spread across the ground. The farmhouse sat just outside our main work zone, maybe 200 yards away. From where we worked, its upper windows faced us. I noticed movement there a little after sunset. At first I thought it was a reflection or a bird crossing behind the frame. Then it happened again. Something shifted inside the second-floor window. A shape moved across and then disappeared. Aaron saw it too. The house had no doors. The entryways were open. No vehicle tracks nearby. That left one likely explanation. Squatters. That mattered for our safety and for the equipment. People living rough sometimes took anything portable. We decided to check the house before finishing setup. The walkover felt longer than it should have. The wind was louder near the structure, pushing through the empty window frames and broken boards. The place smelled old and dry, like dust and sun-baked wood. The front doorway had no door at all, just a rectangular opening. Inside, the air felt cooler. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust and fine dirt blown in over years. Every step left a clear print. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. There were no other footprints. We moved slowly through the ground floor. Kitchen empty. Cabinets hanging open, warped and split. Living area stripped down to bare walls. No trash, no blankets, no food containers, nothing that suggested someone had been staying there. The dust on the floor was undisturbed except for our tracks. The staircase stood against the back wall. It creaked under our weight as we went up. The second floor had 2 small rooms and 1 larger bedroom. The larger room held the only piece of furniture in the entire house. A mattress on the floor. No frame. No sheets. Just stained fabric and exposed padding. The dust around it was thick, like everywhere else. But the center of the mattress had a deep depression, still holding shape. Not flattened from age. It looked fresh, as if someone had been lying or standing there and had just gotten up. The surface was still slightly raised around the edges of the indentation. There were no footprints leading to or away from it. That was when we heard movement downstairs. Slow steps across the floor. One step, then another. The sound of weight shifting on old wood. Aaron was standing next to me. Neither of us had moved. The footsteps stopped. We stayed still for a few seconds, listening. The wind pushed through the broken windows. The house creaked. Nothing else. We started moving again toward the stairs. The footsteps began again below us. They matched our movement. When we stopped, they stopped. We went down slowly, keeping our eyes on the open rooms. The ground floor was empty, exactly as we had left it. No one outside the windows. No sound except wind and the occasional metal groan from the windmill behind the house. We walked straight out without checking further. Back at the truck, we stood there for a minute, watching the house. The sky was almost dark now, deep blue fading toward black. The upstairs windows were just rectangles of shadow. Then something moved across the second-floor window again. This time it was clear. A pale vertical shape crossed from one side to the other. Too tall for a normal person unless standing on something elevated. The movement was smooth and slow, not like someone walking. It passed the window and disappeared. Neither of us went back. We packed the equipment we had already set up and drove out with headlights on. Neither of us wanted to stay after dark. The next morning we returned with a plan to finish quickly and avoid the house area. When we reached the property, we saw fresh tire tracks near the homestead that were not ours. They came from the direction of a service road that did not show up on our maps. While we worked, a county deputy drove out to the site. He had been asked by the landowner to check on activity after a nearby ranch reported unknown vehicles moving at night. We told him what we saw. He went to inspect the house while we stayed by the equipment. He came back 20 minutes later with a simple explanation. The property had been used for illegal migration staging. Small groups were dropped there at night by transport drivers. They waited inside the house until pickup vehicles arrived from the highway several miles away. To avoid leaving tracks, they entered and moved along the edges where old floorboards were exposed, or where dust had already been disturbed years earlier. Some stood on the mattress to look out the second-floor window for approaching vehicles. The footsteps we heard were likely someone hiding on the first floor while we were upstairs. They would have stayed quiet and moved only when we moved, trying to stay out of sight. The pale shape in the window was probably clothing or a blanket held up while someone stood on the mattress to check the road. The fresh tire tracks matched that pattern. The deputy advised us to avoid the structure and report any activity immediately. He also recommended we not work near sunset again. We finished the survey that afternoon and submitted a note to our office declining future visits to the site without security present. The wind turbine project moved forward months later, but our company did not return for additional field work there. I still remember how quiet that house felt when we first walked in. Not empty quiet, the kind where you feel watched but see nothing. At the time it felt like something was wrong with the place itself. Later, knowing people were hiding inside while we moved through the rooms made it worse. There had been someone there with us the whole time, staying just out of sight, waiting for us to leave. August in West Texas is not just hot. It presses down on you like weight. By noon the air feels thick, and by late afternoon the ground throws heat back at your face. That day it reached 104. The horizon shimmered so badly the fence lines looked like they were bending. My cousin and I had been working since morning, replacing broken posts and stretching wire along my uncle's north pasture. A storm was building somewhere to the west. We could see the tall clouds rising, dark at the bottom, white on top, but the wind had not reached us yet. The air was still. The smell of dust and dry grass hung low. The property ran for miles. Mesquite trees stood scattered across the fields, short and twisted, like umbrellas with broken ribs. The ground was hard and pale. No shade except under the trees, and even there the heat stayed trapped. By evening our shirts were stiff with salt. The metal tools burned your hands if you left them in the sun. Around 7 we loaded the last roll of wire onto the ATV and started back toward the trailer. That was when we noticed the cattle. They were gathered near the north gate, packed tight together along the fence line. Not grazing, not moving. Every animal faced outward toward the scrubland beyond the fence. Cattle usually spread out unless something pushes them. When they bunch like that, they are nervous. But even then they shift, circle, make noise. These stood still. The quiet was wrong. No lowing. No hooves scraping. Just flies and the distant hum of insects. The north gate should have been chained. That pasture opened into rough scrub that stretched for miles before any other property. Stray cattle could disappear out there. We drove the ATV toward them. The closer we got, the more the animals pressed together. Some rolled their eyes, but none turned their backs to the fence. The gate stood open. The chain hung loose. It had not been cut. The hook was simply lifted free, and the chain folded neatly over the post. I remember staring at that fold. Whoever opened it took time. The links were lined up instead of tangled. There were no tire tracks near the entrance. The dirt road inside the gate showed only old marks from ranch vehicles, baked hard by the sun. Then I saw the footprints. Bare feet, adult size, clear impressions in the dust just beyond the gate. The soil inside the pasture was softer where vehicles rarely passed. Each step showed heel and toes. The stride was steady, not running, not wandering. The prints led straight away from the fence. We followed them on foot. The heat still radiated off the ground, even as the sun dropped. Sweat ran into my eyes and dried almost immediately. The tracks continued for about 40 feet. Then they stopped. No turn, no drag, no deeper impression like a jump. The last print looked the same as the others. Beyond it, the ground was untouched. We walked in widening circles. Nothing. No brush disturbed. No animal tracks crossing. Just flat dirt and scattered mesquite shadows growing longer. Behind us, the cattle had not moved. Storm clouds thickened as we headed back. The air finally began to shift, carrying the smell of rain that never quite reached us. We closed the gate and wrapped the chain twice, pulling it tight. That night, the temperature stayed above 90 even after dark. The trailer sat alone near the equipment shed. No houses nearby. Just open land and the long fence lines fading into black. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sharp sound. Not wind, not something loose rattling. A solid knock against the side of the trailer. Then a second one. Both hits landed in the same place, hard enough to shake the thin metal wall. My cousin was already awake. We grabbed the rifles from the rack and stepped outside. The night was clear. The storm had moved north. Starlight showed the ground well enough to see shapes out to the fence line. The land lay open for at least 200 yards in every direction. Nothing moved. No truck lights. No person running. No animals near the trailer. The air was still and heavy. I could hear my own breathing and the faint ticking of the trailer cooling. We checked around the wheels and under the hitch. No marks. No dents on the panel where the blows landed. Then we noticed the north pasture. The gate stood open again. We had chained it tight. I remembered pulling the links until they bit into the post. Now the chain hung loose, draped the same careful way as before. At first light, we drove out. The cattle had pulled back from the opening. They stood 30 yards away, scattered but all facing the same direction, watching the gap. The ground near the gate showed fresh footprints. Bare again. Same size. Same steady stride heading inward. This time the prints went farther before stopping. About 70 feet. And again they ended without any sign of where the person went. That pattern continued for 3 days. Each morning the gate was open. Each time the chain was unhooked cleanly, never cut or broken. Each day new footprints appeared, always barefoot, always walking straight in, always stopping somewhere out in the pasture with no return trail. The cattle refused to cross that opening. They grazed around it, but never stepped through. By the 3rd day, my uncle called the sheriff. A deputy came out, walked the tracks, and spent an hour studying the area. He noticed something we had missed. The footprints always stopped near low mesquite clusters. From a distance the trees looked thin, but up close some of them hid shallow ground depressions where roots had lifted the soil years ago. One of those spots covered an old irrigation pit, long abandoned and partly filled with loose dirt and debris. A person could lie flat there and be invisible from any direction beyond a few yards. The deputy circled wider and found faint impressions leading from one hidden spot to another, too light for us to see in the hard light of midday. That afternoon, a search team followed those traces north across the property line into a stretch of neglected land. About a mile out, they found a small camp under a dry creek bank. Blankets, water jugs, and food wrappers. No shoes. They caught the man that evening. He was a migrant worker who had crossed the border weeks earlier and gotten lost trying to avoid roads. The heat had destroyed his boots. He moved at night to stay alive and slept hidden during the day. He had opened the gate each time to slip through the pastures, closing distance toward a highway he believed was north. The knocks on the trailer came when he approached for water, saw movement inside, and panicked. He never meant to harm anyone. He was dehydrated and badly burned by the sun. After that, the chain stayed closed. The cattle crossed the gate the next morning like nothing had happened. But for weeks after, every time I drove out there at dusk, I remembered how they had stood shoulder to shoulder in that heat, silent, facing the open land. Animals notice people long before people notice anything at all. I used to run the backroads of my county in Iowa in the evenings, just as the light faded and the wind carried the faint chill of approaching autumn. The roads were quiet, narrow ribbons between fields, and the horizon always stretched flat and endless. On some nights, the sky was pale pink and blue, melting into gray as the sun disappeared behind the rows of trees at the edges of the cornfields. I knew every curve of the pavement, the spots where the gravel pushed over the asphalt, the dips that filled with water after rain. I liked the predictability, the slow rhythm of my feet against the road, the way the air smelled like drying corn and soil, a smell that made the countryside feel alive even as it emptied for winter. It was late October, the leaves turning gold and brown, brittle underfoot. The sun had already dropped behind the horizon, leaving long shadows stretching across the fields. I was trying to shave a few minutes off my run, so I decided to cut through a harvested cornfield. The stalks were dry and cut close to the ground, stiff and crackling under my feet, leaving sharp scratches on my calves as I moved. The field smelled like dust, dry leaves, and husk. The narrow path I took was uneven, the soil soft in some spots, hard in others, and the stalks bent and snapped as I pressed forward. The silence was absolute, except for the faint wind moving across the open land and the distant hum of farm machinery left idle. Halfway across the field, I became aware of a noise behind me. At first, I assumed it was just my imagination, but then it resolved into clear, deliberate footsteps. Crunching, dry steps among the stalks. I paused and listened. They were moving in sync with me, exactly matching my rhythm. My first thought was that it was another jogger, though I knew the area was remote, and at this hour, there was rarely anyone else out here. I picked up my pace. The steps behind me quickened in perfect alignment. My heart started to beat faster, though my breathing stayed steady, controlled. I stopped abruptly, and the steps continued, one step, then nothing. Silence returned immediately, heavy and tense. I held my breath, unsure if I had imagined the pause, unsure if someone was hiding just beyond the line of sight, watching me. I turned slowly, letting my eyes sweep across the flattened stalks, the irregular furrows of the soil, the rows that seemed straight yet uneven in the fading light. No one. Not a shadow, not a movement, nothing at all. Yet the stalks behind me were pressed down in a narrow, straight line, almost deliberate, leading back toward the edge of the field. My stomach turned, and I forced myself to move backward slowly, keeping my gaze fixed on the flattened stalks until I reached the edge of the field. The roads were empty, the houses sparse and far apart, the only lights distant and scattered. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anyone. The air felt colder than it had moments before, the wind biting lightly at my ears. I tried to rationalize it. A farmer moving equipment? A neighbor taking the same shortcut? Teenagers walking home from town? None of it fit neatly. The precision of the steps, the perfect timing. It didn't match anything I had ever experienced in these fields. I finished my run faster than usual, keeping the streetlights in sight, the familiar hum of my breathing and the slap of my shoes against the pavement grounding me. I reached my house, the old wooden frame, the screen door that never fit quite right, the mailbox half buried in the frost. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, feeling relief and an odd residue of fear lingering in the room, settling like dust on the furniture. I went about the rest of my evening with deliberate normalcy, though sleep came uneasily. At exactly 1:17 a.m., I woke to the soft, careful turning of the doorknob on my back door. The sound was deliberate and measured, cautious, as though whoever was outside didn't want to wake me, yet needed to know the door would give. I lay in bed, still and silent, listening as the handle moved, the wood creaking slightly under gentle pressure. I did not call out, did not move. It was not an audible demand or threat. It was methodical, almost clinical. Minutes passed. I could hear the faint scraping of shoes across the frost-covered ground. Eventually, the door ceased to move. The world fell silent again. The frost outside glimmered under moonlight, undisturbed. No footprints. No disturbance at all. I called the sheriff the next morning. He came quickly, a short, stocky man familiar with the rural roads, the fields, and the empty nights. He looked around the frost and the door, checked the lock, and shrugged. Teenagers looking for a thrill, he said. Kids walking the backroads, nothing more. He didn't find footprints, didn't find a mark in the frost. I told myself he was right. I wanted to believe him. Weeks passed. I ran again, cautiously, sticking to the paved roads, avoiding shortcuts. The memory of the field lingered, the exact rhythm of those steps, the way they had mirrored mine with impossible precision. I never saw another person in that stretch at dusk. I never heard the doorknob again. The field remained harvested, empty, and quiet, except for the wind and the occasional crunch of my shoes on the stalks. Eventually, I accepted the reality of what had happened. No ghosts, no monsters, no supernatural forces. Just someone somewhere, following the same paths, aware of my presence, careful enough to remain invisible, yet close enough to unsettle me completely. The nights were longer, the frost colder, and I learned to move through the world with awareness I had never carried before. The cornfield, the footsteps, the frozen doorknob, they became a lesson in caution, a reminder of how easily someone can be close without ever being seen. That was enough. I never ran that shortcut again. In the spring of 2002, I inherited my grandfather's house in the countryside of an unnamed part of Eastern Europe. The property had been in our family for decades. After he died, no one wanted to live that far from the city. The plan was simple. I would go alone, clean the place, handle the paperwork, and sell it before winter. The house stood at the edge of a small village surrounded by flat fields and thin strips of forest. The road that led there was cracked and narrow, bordered by weeds and leaning fence posts. The property itself sat on slightly higher ground, with a sagging barn to one side and a vegetable patch long overtaken by grass. Behind the house, near the tree line, was a circular stone well covered with a wooden lid that had turned gray with age. I arrived in late afternoon. The house smelled of dust and old fabric. Curtains hung stiff in the windows. The kitchen table still had a plastic tablecloth with faded fruit patterns. Everything felt preserved, as if my grandfather had stepped out and would return at dusk. The first evening, I walked the perimeter of the property to check for damage. The well caught my attention because it looked out of place, older than the house itself. The stones were uneven and darkened by time. Moss grew between the cracks. The wooden lid sat flush on top, secured only by its weight. A woman from the neighboring farm stopped by before sunset to see who had arrived. She recognized me from childhood visits. Her eyes lingered on the yard behind the house. She mentioned the well and said it should remain closed. She framed it as a village belief, something passed down without clear reason. I nodded and changed the subject. That night, I slept in my grandfather's bedroom. The mattress sagged in the center. The silence felt thick. There were no cars, no distant traffic, only wind moving through grass. I woke several times, disoriented by the absence of city noise. The next day, I began cleaning. I sorted through drawers filled with receipts, tools, and yellowed photographs. I carried broken chairs to the barn. Around midday, I walked to the well. I stood over it for a while before touching the lid. The wood felt dry and rough under my fingers. I told myself I was only checking its condition. I lifted it carefully and set it aside. The well was not deep. I estimated around 12 feet from the rim to the bottom. It was dry. The base was covered in compacted dirt and small stones. There was no rope, no bucket. I leaned closer and noticed marks along the inner stone wall. Vertical lines cut into the surface, close together, extending from near the bottom up toward the opening. They were uneven but consistent in direction. Some were deeper than others. They did not look like tool marks. They looked like repeated scraping. I felt a slow tightening in my chest. I told myself there were simple explanations. Perhaps someone had lowered equipment into the well. Perhaps metal had rubbed against the stone over time. I replaced the lid and returned to the house. That evening, I kept the window open because the air inside felt stale. The sky turned dark blue, then black. I lay awake longer than usual. Around midnight, I heard a sound that cut through the quiet. A scraping noise, short and sharp. It seemed to come from outside, somewhere behind the house. I sat up and listened. Nothing followed. After nearly an hour, the same sound came again. A brief scrape against stone. The pattern repeated. Once every hour, almost precise. I convinced myself it was an animal brushing against the well. The lid was loose. Perhaps wind shifted it slightly. I did not go outside to check. I locked the back door and stayed in bed until morning. On the third day, I examined the area around the well in daylight. The grass near it was flattened in places, though that could have been from my own steps. The lid had not moved. I considered ignoring it. Instead, I decided to test my assumption. I went into the kitchen and found a bag of flour. I sprinkled a thick ring around the base of the well, careful not to leave gaps. The white powder stood out against the dark soil. If an animal came near it during the night, there would be prints. That evening, the scraping returned. It was the same sound. Short, direct, as if something solid dragged across rough stone. I forced myself to remain calm. I told myself I would have proof in the morning. At dawn, I walked outside before making coffee. The air felt colder than the previous days. I approached the well slowly. The flower had been disturbed. The ring was broken on one side. Marks crossed through it. I crouched down and studied them. They were not paw prints. They were narrow and elongated, with defined toes and a clear arch bare human footprints. They began at the well's base and continued in a straight line toward the trees. The stride was steady. No signs of stumbling. No shoe impressions. Just skin against flour and soil. My first thought was that someone had trespassed during the night. The village was small. It was possible that someone knew I was alone and decided to play a trick. I followed the prints as far as I could. They faded once they reached the grass at the edge of the woods. I returned to the house and examined the back door. The lock was intact. Windows were closed. Nothing inside appeared disturbed. I checked the barn. Empty. I went back to the well and removed the lid again. The interior looked unchanged, but I climbed down using the uneven stones as footholds. The air inside was cool and dry. I ran my hand over the vertical scratches. They were spaced irregularly, but followed a clear upward path. Near the bottom, I noticed something I had missed before. In one corner, partially covered by dirt, lay a small metal ring attached to a short length of chain. It was rusted but intact. I pulled it free. The chain led to nothing. It had been broken at the other end. I stood there, looking up at the circle of sky above me. The scratches made sense in a way I did not want to accept. They were too high and too deliberate to be random damage. They looked like repeated attempts to climb without support. I climbed out and sat on the ground beside the well. I remembered stories about the years after the war, about poverty and hidden conflicts that never made it into official records. Wells were common storage places. They were also places where unwanted things were hidden. I did not call the police immediately. I drove into the village first and asked the oldest resident about the property's history. He did not seem surprised by my questions. He mentioned that my grandfather had bought the house at a low price in the early 1960s. The previous owner had disappeared. The explanation at the time was that he left for work in another region. I returned to the house and made the call. Authorities arrived that afternoon. They drained what little debris was left at the bottom and began digging. Within hours, they uncovered human remains buried beneath a shallow layer of soil. The bones were positioned upright against the wall. The scratches were made by fingernails. The chain had likely secured the person at some point before breaking or being removed. The well had been used as a holding place. Forensic examination later confirmed the remains belonged to a man who matched the description of the previous owner. The estimated time of death aligned with the period before my grandfather purchased the property. There was no evidence tying my grandfather to the crime. The suspicion fell on local figures long dead or untraceable. The scraping I heard was not supernatural. It was the wooden lid shifting slightly when the night air cooled and contracted the wood. The sound traveled along the stone shaft and echoed. The timing felt deliberate because temperature drops tend to occur in steady intervals during clear nights. The footprints were from a young man in the village who later admitted to approaching the well out of curiosity. He had heard that I opened it. He wanted to see inside after dark and panicked when he noticed the flower. He ran toward the woods to avoid being seen. The explanation removed the mystery, but not the weight. I arranged for the remains to be properly buried. The well was filled with concrete under official supervision. The house was sold months later at a reduced price. I left the village with a clear understanding of what had happened there decades earlier. The well behind my grandfather's house was not cursed. It was a hidden crime scene that survived through silence and soil. The sounds I heard were physical. The prints belonged to a living person. The scratches were made by someone who had tried to climb out and failed. I do not return to that place. I do not think about it often. But when I do, I remember the vertical lines in stone and the narrow ring of white flour broken by human steps. I was 19 that September and working a short contract on a hill farm in Cumbria. The work was steady and quiet, which suited me. I had grown up in a town and wanted space, fresh air, and a bit of money before the winter term. The farmhouse stood alone on a rise, with fields stepping down toward a line of mixed woodland that followed a shallow valley. The lower pasture was the furthest from the house, about half a mile across uneven ground and 2 gates away. Most evenings ended the same way. Feed the dogs, stack tools, check gates, and look over the sheep before the light went. The farmer trusted routine more than anything. Problems showed themselves when the routine was kept. That evening the air felt thick even before I left the yard. The sky was clear, but the light had a dull tone, the kind that comes when the sun drops behind the ridge earlier than you expect. There was no wind. The trees at the valley edge stood still, every leaf flat. The lower field held about 60 ewes and a few late lambs. As I walked down the slope, I noticed something wrong before I reached the gate. The flock was packed tightly into the far corner near the treeline. They were not grazing. They were pressed together, heads raised, bodies angled in the same direction. When sheep cluster like that, it usually means a dog has been near, or a fox moving along the edge. I went through the gate and started across the field, calling softly and clapping once, the way I had been shown. Normally they would spread out and drift away from me. They did not move. As I got closer, I heard the sound they were making. It was not the usual calling or restless noise. It was a low, steady bleating, almost like a hum. Their ears were forward. Their eyes were open wide and fixed on the trees. I slowed down. The ground near the corner dipped slightly, and the grass was worn short where they had stood for a while. One ewe lay on her side a few yards from the fence. At first I thought she was resting, but her neck was stretched out and her legs were stiff. I walked over and crouched beside her. She was dead. The body was still warm. There was no blood, no bite marks, no torn wool. The eyes were open but dry. The tongue was not out. She looked as if she had fallen and never moved again. I stood up and looked back at the flock. Every animal was still facing the same point in the treeline. What stayed with me was their eyes. Sheep blink often, especially when flies are about. That evening they hardly blinked at all. Their gaze did not shift when I moved. The fence in that corner ran close to the woods, with only a narrow strip of rough ground between wire and trees. Hawthorn, bramble, and young ash grew thick there. The light was already fading under the canopy, even though the field still held a dull glow. I walked toward the fence to check for damage. The air changed as I got closer. It felt close and damp, with a faint smell of earth and something sour underneath. Not rot exactly, but stale, like water that had stood too long. Halfway there, the sound started. Breathing. At first I thought it was my own breath echoing in my ears. I stopped walking and held still. The sound continued. Slow, deep, drawn in through a large chest and let out in long, heavy releases. It came from inside the trees, just beyond the wire. I stepped closer to the fence and looked through the gaps in the branches. The undergrowth was dense and shadowed. I could not see more than a few feet in. No movement showed. No shape. Only dark stems and tangled leaves. The breathing went on, slow and steady. It did not change pace when I moved. It did not sound like a sheep or a dog. It sounded large, close to the ground but heavy in the chest, as if whatever it was had weight behind it. I did not call out. I did not step into the rough strip. I stood there listening, trying to make sense of it. For a moment I wondered if it was cattle from the other side of the woods, but there were no cattle kept nearby. I knew the boundaries by then. Then the breathing stopped. There was a short pause. The woods went silent, even the small sounds of insects and leaves settling. The silence felt thick and sudden. A sharp exhale came from the same spot, loud and forceful, like air pushed out in a burst. The flock broke at once. All 60 sheep turned and ran as a single mass, straight across the field. The sound of hooves and bodies hit like a wave. I had just enough time to step sideways before they surged past. One clipped my leg and nearly knocked me down. They did not stop until they reached the far gate. I did not look back at the trees again. I crossed the field quickly, shut the gate behind me, and headed uphill without stopping. That night I wrote the death in the notebook and left the rest for morning. I did not sleep well. The farmhouse was quiet, but every time the wind shifted around the walls I woke, expecting to hear that slow breathing again. At first light the farmer walked down to the lower field. I went with him. The dead ewe was where I had found her. 2 more lay near the fence, both on their sides, both with no marks. All 3 bodies were stiff and slightly bloated, which meant they had died during the night. He checked the wire. No breaks. No wool caught. No tracks that showed a dog or fox. The ground near the trees was disturbed, but not in a clear pattern. Just churned earth where the flock had crowded and shifted. The carcasses were opened later that day. There were no signs of attack and no disease that showed in the organs. The lungs were heavy and dark. The vet's report suggested acute stress leading to collapse, possibly heart failure triggered by panic. Sheep are prone to that if chased or frightened hard enough. A few days later, a neighbor mentioned seeing a large bull wandering the woods in late summer. It had broken from a herd miles away and had been moving along the valley edges, feeding and bedding down in thick cover. A full-grown bull, even a calm one, breathes loud and deep when resting. If it had stood just inside the trees, the flock would have scented it and held tight watching. A sudden movement or snort from an animal that size could have sent them into a surge. The pressure of 60 bodies packed tight can crush weaker ones or push them into collapse from stress alone. That matched what we saw. No one ever confirmed the bull, but tracks were found later that month near the stream below the woods. Large, cloven, and fresh. The lower field was never the same after that. The flock stayed uneasy near the tree-line and gathered there again more than once, even after the bull was likely moved on or culled. That winter the farmer sold the pasture to a neighbor who planned to clear the woodland edge back by 20 yards. I left the job in October, but one memory stayed with me more than the dead sheep or the reports. It was the stillness in that corner at dusk. The way 60 animals watched one point without blinking. And the sound of something large and unseen drawing slow air through its chest, close enough that I could hear each breath as if it were standing just beyond the wire. My name is Daniel Reeves. In October 2017, I drove to Adams County, Pennsylvania, to photograph abandoned farmsteads for a small local history blog I had started after leaving my office job. I wanted quiet places and honest decay. Empty fields and old structures felt easier to understand than people. The day I found Miller's farm was cool and overcast. Low clouds flattened the light and took the color out of everything. The leaves were mostly down, and the hills looked thin and tired. I had spent the morning driving back roads, stopping when I saw a sagging barn or a collapsed shed. Around noon I pulled into a small diner outside Gettysburg. I was studying a county atlas at the counter when an elderly man mentioned a place north of town. He said there had been a farm there years ago. The house burned. The orchard was still standing. No one had lived there since the early 1980s. The directions were simple. A narrow road, a gravel turnoff, then a field lane that looked like it belonged to no one. The property did not appear on my map. That was not unusual. Older farms were often absorbed into larger parcels, their names forgotten. The lane led through tall grass and ended at a wide clearing. The house was gone. Only a low concrete foundation remained, filled with weeds and broken bricks. A rusted well cap sat nearby. Beyond the clearing, about 100 yards back, stood the orchard. Even from a distance it looked wrong. The trees were old and poorly maintained, their branches twisted and bare. They stood in uneven rows, many leaning at slight angles. Fallen apples covered the ground, most of them split open and dark with rot. The air carried a thick, sweet smell that reminded me of cider left too long in a warm room. I walked into the first row and began taking photographs. The light was flat but useful. Every surface showed texture. Bark peeling away, fruit melting into the soil. The ground was soft and spongy under my boots. About 5 minutes in, I heard something move off to my right. Crunch. I stopped and listened. The orchard was quiet except for a distant road and a few crows. I assumed it was a deer. There were plenty in the area. I kept walking. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. The sound came again, parallel to me, somewhere beyond the next row. The spacing caught my attention. The steps were slow and deliberate. Each one landed after I moved. I stopped. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing moved. No branches shifted. No animal broke cover. I walked forward again. Crunch. The timing matched my pace. At first I told myself it was echo. The rows were narrow. Sound could bounce in strange ways. But the ground was soft with leaves and fruit. There was nothing hard enough to carry a sharp echo. I moved across 2 more rows, angling toward the sound. Each step I took was followed by another, always off to the side, never ahead or behind. The rhythm stayed consistent. Not fast, not slow, measured. When I reached the edge of the orchard, I saw a drainage ditch running along the back. It was shallow, maybe 3 feet deep, cut to carry runoff toward a wooded area. The soil there was dark and damp. I stepped down carefully and looked at the mud. There were prints. They were shaped like human footprints, but longer than normal. The toes were narrow and pointed forward. The heel marks were deep, deeper than the front, as if whoever made them leaned forward when walking. The stride length was short and even. The prints ran parallel to the rows, matching the path I had taken. I crouched and photographed them. The edges were sharp. They were recent. I looked up toward the woods. Nothing moved. The trees beyond the ditch were dense and shadowed. The ground there rose slightly toward the old house site. I climbed out of the ditch and walked toward the foundation. If someone was living on the property or using it as a campsite, I wanted to know before I kept working. The foundation was empty except for weeds and scattered debris. I walked the perimeter and checked the well cap. It was sealed and rusted in place. No vehicles were nearby. No trash, no bedding, no signs of recent activity. I turned back toward the orchard. Something rolled past my right boot and stopped against a clump of grass. It was an apple. There was no wind. The air was still enough that the smell of fermentation hung in place. I stood there and listened. No footsteps. No movement. Just the quiet and the distant sound of traffic miles away. I walked back into the rows to retrieve my camera bag. The spacing between the trees felt tighter than before. The rows looked less straight. Branches hung lower. I had the uneasy sense that my path out was longer than my path in. Halfway through, I saw fresh impressions in the soft ground ahead of me. Long, narrow prints, placed one after another in a straight line across the row I was about to enter. They had not been there earlier. I was certain of that. I had walked this exact path. The direction of the prints was toward the ditch. I did not take more photographs. I left the orchard and walked straight back to my car without stopping. I kept looking behind me across the field, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. No one appeared. The drive back to town took about 20 minutes. I went straight to the county historical office the next morning. I wanted ownership records and any incident reports connected to the property. The farm had belonged to a family named Miller. The house fire occurred in 1982. No injuries were reported from the fire itself. The property was later absorbed into a neighboring tract and left unused. There was one additional note in an older file. A farmhand had been reported missing in late 1981. According to the record, he was last seen working in the orchard near the drainage ditch. The initial assumption was that he slipped and struck his head during heavy rain. The ditch had flooded earlier that week. Search crews found no body. The ditch, as it exists now, is only 3 feet deep. But the report included a detail that was not mentioned elsewhere. At the time of the incident, a section of the drainage line had collapsed underground. Water had cut a narrow channel beneath the surface, creating a hidden cavity. The soil above it looked stable until weight broke through. That section was repaired the following spring. By then the farm was already in decline. I contacted the neighboring property owner a few days later. He confirmed that people occasionally crossed the land to hunt or explore. He also mentioned that the ground near the ditch still shifted after heavy rain. Parts of the old drainage system were unstable. If someone walked along the same path repeatedly, the surface could compress and crack, causing nearby fruit or loose soil to shift downhill. That explained the apple. It also explained the prints. The area parallel to the rows sits on a slight slope. As I walked, the ground beside me would have settled in response to my weight, especially over old drainage lines. Each step I took could have triggered small collapses or shifts along the weak channel, creating fresh impressions and movement that matched my pace. The sound I heard was not footsteps. It was the ground responding to mine. I never posted the photographs from Miller's farm. I still write about abandoned places, but I avoid properties with old drainage systems or neglected irrigation lines. Land that looks stable is not always solid underneath. That orchard was quiet and empty, but the earth there was moving with me the entire time.